Okay, so hopefully you're all seeing the first slide on the page now. Let me just sort out so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, welcome everybody to today's talk. Great to have so many people joining us and to spending your lunchtime finding out about bee flies. And we have slightly got you under, or at least I've slightly got you here under false pretenses, because I couldn't quite work out how to do the Z bit of the A to Z. So really what we're going to be doing is more of an A to a V of bee flies, really. I couldn't find a Z to go with it. We have got an A though, definitely. So just to start off with a little bit of background, part of what we'll talk about in the last section of the talk is the Bee Fly Watch project, which is something we've been doing for a few years now, and that comes under the banner of the Soldierflies and Allies recording scheme. And as Dan mentioned, we'll be talking more about the scheme as a whole later in the year. But the scheme covers 11 different families of flies, one of which is the bee fly family. And it's one of a large number of Diptera recording schemes that are part of Dipteristforum. And Diptera is the name for the order of insects that is the flies, the true flies. So Dipteristforum is the organisation that coordinates a lot of the recording and conservation activity around flies. And Dipteristforum's had a long relationship with Field Studies Council. We have an annual spring course at Preston Montford Centre and a number of other Diptera courses that are associated there as well. So lots of links there, but today's focus is very definitely on the bee flies. And hopefully many of you are already familiar with bee flies, and if you're not, you've definitely got a treat in store if you go and look for them over the coming weeks. They are fairly distinctive and not too many identification challenges, at least for looking at the spring bee flies. And the one we've got on the screen here is the most widespread and frequent. Something going on with the muting now. I think I was muted for a second, but I'm hopefully unmuted again now. So this is the dark-edged bee fly, and you'll be able to see immediately where it gets its name from. It has that distinctive blackish stripe along the front edge of the wings. Sometimes people just call it the common bee fly or the greater bee fly, because its scientific name, Bombilius major, implies that it is the biggest one, although it's not actually that much bigger than the other related bee flies. But dark-edged bee fly is the official common name for this species. And in a lot of ways, it is a typical fly. It has the head of a fly, and then the rest of the body is divided up into the thorax and the abdomen, with the wings and the legs all attached to the thorax, and just the one pair of wings, as with virtually all other true flies. But you'll immediately see one of the distinctive things about this group of bee flies is that very long proboscis, which is a very familiar sight once you start to see these creatures flying around. And they use that to feed on flowers, as we shall see in a moment. So as a group, the bee flies that have the long proboscis are really distinctive. There are some other bee flies that don't have the long proboscis, and we'll look at some examples of those a bit later on. So why do they have the long proboscis? Well, it is to help them feed at flowers, and you can observe them going into some of the flowers that have much longer tubes in their structure. So we're looking at a bee fly feeding on a primrose here, and bee flies do particularly like primroses, and their long proboscis enables them to get to the base of the primrose flower tube, which is where the nectaries are found, so that it can feed on the nectar. And in the process of doing so, it does pick up a certain amount of pollen as well, and bee flies do act as pollinators. They're not the sole pollinators for any particular plant species, but they are one of a number of early spring insects that are critical to the pollination of some of the early spring flowers. And as I say, primroses are one of their favourites, although they do visit a wide range of flowers. So the proboscis definitely gives them an advantage over many other flies that don't have such extended mouth parts, in that they can include some of these long structured flowers in their diet. You may be able to see just at the tip of the proboscis here, and on the front leg of this bee fly, there is some pollen sticking to the leg and the proboscis there. And as I say, they do definitely play a role in pollination. How big a role is quite hard to say. And for some flowers, at least, the bee flies don't seem to actually get very close to them. They're quite happy to sort of hover in front of the flower and just touch the flower with the tip of their proboscis. And in those cases, they probably don't do a lot of pollination. But with the flowers where they are delving right down to the base of the flower, it does make much more of a difference there. And they do pick up a lot of pollen on the proboscis and even on the body and legs as well. So they're definitely got a role to play there. So this is a fantastic photo by Luke Chambers showing the proboscis from the underside. And it is really quite an amazing structure. There's quite a lot of detail to it once you start looking at it really, really closely. And it is adapted from the typical fly mouth parts. It has all the same structures that the typical fly would have, but they are greatly extended. So most flies have quite a short set of mouth parts that end in a sort of fairly spongy pair of lips, if you like. And the bee flies have that same structure, but everything is elongated so that there is this long proboscis. And at the tip of the proboscis, there are the labella, which are the equivalent of the sort of more spongy structure that most flies have. And they do use the proboscis to actually suck up liquids, to suck up the nectar from the flowers. So it's a little bit like feeding through a sort of drinking straw. It's that sort of thing that they're doing. But whereas if we use a straw to drink from, the straw's in our mouth and we're sucking the liquid into our mouth, the bee flies, the way they do it is to actually have their lips at the end of the straw. So right at the tip of the proboscis, that's where there are a number of structures here that sort of are roughly equivalent to lips. And they do have a lot of control over those lips. It isn't just a long fixed tube. They can move and extend and slightly open the lips at the end of the proboscis. And as well as taking up nectar, that allows them to pick up pollen, and they do ingest some of the pollen grains to provide themselves with an additional protein meal. So if you watch them really, really carefully when they're visiting flowers, you'll actually see that the proboscis is quite mobile, and it's definitely under their control. It's not just a fixed tube. They are able to flex it and to manipulate the structures at the tip. Depending on what they're actually trying to do and what they're trying to feed on. And there's a whole lot of sensory hairs right at the tip of the proboscis that allow them to probe into the flower and find exactly what they're after. So there's quite a lot of fascinating stuff going on there. And as I say, they do visit quite a wide range of flowers. This is one on one of the catkins of the goat willow or pussy willow catkins, which a lot of insects are fond of visiting in the spring. And sometimes you'll see bee flies quite high up in the sallow trees feeding on the catkins. They usually do that when the temperatures are a little bit warmer. It allows them to get a bit more active. And they are very temperature dependent. And the other thing that you'll see bee flies doing quite a lot, particularly in the early spring, is just sitting and basking. And they'll often do that on some dead leaves or perhaps on a patch of bare ground or on a stone. And this allows them to bask in the sunshine and warm themselves up and get to the point where they can become more active and start flying around and feeding and mating and everything else that they need to do. So certainly in the early part of the spring, that's where to look for them, is visiting flowers, particularly the early spring flowers such as primroses, but you'll also see them just sitting on places such as bare ground and dead leaves to warm themselves up. And the best places to look are where it's really sheltered and perhaps in a little corner where the sun has got in and just warmed up that little patch. Those are the sort of places that they like to be in the early part of the spring.
I got the ghost
So I think in the publicity that went out for today's talk, we said that they were fluffy, cute and deadly. And I don't think anybody can argue about them being fluffy. They are quite fluffy things. And I think that's one of the reasons why they got called bee flies in the first place, is because they do look a bit like fluffy bumblebees in their shape. I think they're cute. A lot of people tell me they think that they're cute, but I guess that's a bit of a matter of opinion. But why are they deadly? The flies themselves aren't deadly. They don't have any means of biting or stinging. They are flower visitors and entirely vegetarian. So to find out about the deadly part of the equation, we need to look at their life history in a bit more detail. So these are a couple of excellent photos by Will George showing a mating pair of bee flies. And as you can see, they mate end to end. They are capable of flying around in this position. And the other difference that you might be able to notice on these photos, which just to point out, is this works in a similar way to it for a lot of the hoverflies, that you can tell whether they're male or female by looking at the eyes. And the male bee flies, just like many of the male hoverflies, the eyes actually meet each other on top of the head. So there's just a very narrow line between the two eyes at the top of the head, whereas the females have a much wider gap between the eyes, and there's a sort of slightly fluffy bit of the top of the head between the eyes for the females. So obviously the bee flies need to mate in order to fertilize the eggs of the female, but then the female has quite a lot of elaborate behaviors in order to lay the eggs. And the photo on the left here shows a female bee fly who's landed on the ground, and she's buzzing her wings and she's wiggling around and rubbing her backside along the ground. And people often think that what she's doing is actually egg laying at that point, which is not the case. What she's doing is collecting up little grains of sand and soil into a special container at the tip of her abdomen. And this is known as the sand chamber at the tip of the abdomen of the bee fly. And the female needs to go out and collect these sand grains. Some people describe this behavior as a sort of twerking. They're sort of doing a little dance over the soil and waving their backside around and picking up these sand grains. And she then flies off with them, and bee flies actually lay their eggs in flight. So she goes off to find somewhere to lay the eggs, and you can, when they're doing this, you can see them sort of hovering, and every so often they'll dip and they'll curve their abdomen around a little bit and sort of fire off an egg in the direction that they're trying to aim it. And as she does that, the egg is slightly moist and slightly sticky, and it picks up some of the sand or soil grains that she's collected, and those coat the egg and provide a bit of extra protection to prevent it drying out. And this is a particular adaptation for bee flies that seems to be sort of quite unique, that they use when they are laying their eggs. So it's quite an elaborate process that the female has to go through to get herself ready to lay the eggs, and then to actually fire the eggs where they need to go. And where do they need to go? Bee flies are parasitoids of solitary bees. So this is where we start getting into the deadly end of the equation. The larvae of the bee fly actually need to get into a solitary bee burrow in order to feed on the things in the burrow, including the solitary bee larva itself. So the female is looking to fire her eggs in the direction of solitary bee burrows. And there was a nice bit of research that came out in 2009 by Roberto Boesi and colleagues, looking at, oh, bit of background noise there. Looking at the way in which female bee flies behave when they're trying to lay their eggs. So the first chart we're looking at here is how much of their time they spend investigating different targets. And what they're actually looking for, as we've said, are the solitary bee burrows, but they're not terribly good at finding them straight away. So they do spend quite a lot of time investigating bits of vegetation and just gaps in the soil or bits of twig on the ground. However, although they're not necessarily terribly good at finding them straight away, when they do find a bee burrow, they do seem to be able to recognize it. And in this study, it was shown that they fire a lot more of their eggs when they found a bee burrow than they do when they're just sort of looking around hoping to find things and actually finding other types of thing on the ground. So it is a little bit hit and miss, and some of the eggs undoubtedly end up wasted and nowhere near a bee burrow, but they do seem to have some control over this and can target themselves. They also lay an awful lot of eggs. It's been estimated that each individual bee fly can lay somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 3,000 eggs. So that again gives you the idea that probably an awful lot of those eggs don't ever get the chance to develop in the right way. But because the bee flies lay so many, hopefully a few of them, as far as the bee fly is concerned, will get through and survive. The next few slides I'm going to show you are based on some really detailed investigation that Martin Drake did back in 2013. And I think this was a brilliant bit of natural history that anybody could do. He didn't really have any elaborate equipment for this, but he just took a very careful approach. Starting off from the fact that just outside his house in Devon, Martin had an earth bank that had an awful lot of solitary bee burrows in it. And these were all burrows of the ashy mining bee, Andrena cineraria, which is one of the hosts for the dark-edged bee fly. It's not the only one. The bee fly is associated with a number of different Andrena solitary bees, but this one is one that often does support it. So Martin is a dipterist, and although he was, I'm sure, no doubt pleased to see the solitary bees, he was also very interested to know what the bee flies were doing. So one year he took it upon himself to go out there every hour, every day from the 6th to the 29th of April and try to find the bee flies as they were emerging from the burrows to get an idea of the population size and what they were doing. So, as we said, the bee flies flick their eggs towards the burrows, and when the eggs hatch, the first stage of the larva, which is the long thin one on the left of the screen here, is quite mobile, and once it hatches, it moves around and tries to find its way into a solitary bee burrow. If it succeeds in doing that, it then becomes more stationary, and as it sheds its skin and develops into the next instar, it becomes much more of a grub-like creature. It doesn't need to move around very far anymore. It's found its burrow, and it can just attach itself to the bee. It probably feeds a little bit on the mixture of pollen and nectar in the burrow as well, but it does feed directly on the bee's own larva. And if it succeeds in doing that, it stays in the burrow and pupates in the burrow, and the following spring it then needs to make its way to the surface. And what we can see in the picture here are 3 of the pupal cases where the pupa has wiggled its way to the surface of the soil and the bee fly has emerged and left behind that pupal case. And this is what Martin Drake was looking for along his bee bank during the April. And he was looking for both the empty pupal cases and the bee flies as they emerge. And the pupal cases themselves are quite fascinating structures. These are a couple of photos by Mark Taylor showing the amazing range of spines and hairs on the pupa of the bee fly. And the long spines at the front end seem to be used to help it dig itself out of the ground and get up to the top of the soil in order for it to be able to emerge from the pupa. Martin Drake was able to observe this emergence and time what was happening. So the bee fly pushes itself out of the pupal case and emerges from that. And as with many winged insects that come out of a pupal case, initially it looks very sort of bedraggled and quite swollen because it's got a lot of liquid inside its body. It then has to pump that liquid into the wings to expand them. And initially the long proboscis is folded back under the body and that needs to come out. And it takes it quite a while to go through this process. So Martin timed it at getting on for 10 minutes to initially emerge from the pupal case. And he carried on watching this particular emerged fly. And after 10 minutes, it's escaped from the pupal case, but it's still got quite a long way to go to actually fully expand its wings. And it's very vulnerable at this stage, of course. It can't immediately fly. It's quite a soft and not very mobile creature. So an awful lot of bee flies probably do perish at this stage, getting eaten by birds or by other insect predators. So it is quite a risky time in the life of the fly. After about 30 minutes, though, it has expanded its wings and gets to the point where it can think about flying away. And Martin's observations and other people's observations show that most of the emergence of the bee flies happens quite early in the day, somewhere around 8 or 9 in the morning, which allows the flies to emerge and start to warm up, hopefully if the sun shines out, and then they can fly away and get on with their life fairly early in the day. So Martin, during that length of time in April, Martin counted about 160 bee flies emerging from this particular bank outside his house, and he wanted to find out what proportion of the solitary bee population had been affected by the bee flies. So he went a little bit further with his investigations and put out some quadrats to count the number of solitary bee burrows along a portion of the bank, and tried to work out how many bee burrows there were across the whole bank and what proportion of them the bee flies had emerged from. And these were the answers that he got. So there were almost 1,000 nest holes in this length of bank, and obviously there would have been a male and a female bee associated with populating those nest holes, although the females would have done most of the work of digging them. And that count of 160 bee flies emerging represents about 8% of a parasitism rate. So 8% of the bee burrows produced a bee fly and therefore lost at least one of their bee larvae. And that percentage, some other studies have looked at this and come out with slightly lower percentages. Martin's percentage seems to be at the higher end of the range, but that does seem to be the sort of level of parasitism that can occur on these large solitary bee colonies. So if you're a solitary bee, a bee fly definitely is a deadly creature. But bee flies and bees have been around together for a long time. They've evolved together. It's a perfectly natural part of what happens in the life of the solitary bees. And some of the main hosts for the bee flies are species of solitary bee that have actually increased their range quite a lot in recent years. So people do sometimes ask me if we should be worried about bee flies being one of the many things that could be causing damage to the bee populations at the moment. And it does seem that that's not the case. The bee flies are a natural part of what goes on with solitary bees, and there doesn't seem to be any effect of the bee flies knocking the solitary bees back in population terms. And indeed, you can argue that seeing bee flies is a good indication that you've got a very healthy population of solitary bees. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to support the bee flies. So I think that was a brilliant piece of detective work that Martin Drake did, and he published it all in the British NSOC journal. So it's well worth a read if you ever get a chance to follow that up. And it's the sort of investigation that, as I say, anybody could carry out if you've got enough time to go out and watch what's going on with these creatures. So for the next little section of the talk, so far we've only looked at the dark-edged bee fly, which is, as I say, the most common and widespread species, but it isn't the only species of bee fly, of course, and there are a number of others. And in the spring, there are 2 of these bombilius bee flies that both come out early in the spring. And here in this rather amazing photo by Richard Lewington, he's showing off that he's got both of these species in his garden, and got a really good photograph of 2 of them. And you can see straight away which one has got the dark edge to the wing. And even without me telling you, you could probably guess what the other one is called. It's the dotted bee fly, and it has that clear pattern of dots on the wings. So these are the 2 that you are likely to see in the spring. The dotted bee fly is much more restricted in its distribution to the south and central part of England and South Wales. But within that area, it's doing quite well at the moment. And it is possible to see both of these species side by side in that part of the world. So the dotted bee fly has dots on the wings. The females on the right here also have a series of white dots down the middle of the abdomen, which the common dark-edged bee fly does not have. The white dots can wear off when they get a little bit older, but when you get a nice fresh specimen, it's also a really good identification feature for the dotted bee fly. This one is another one to look out for if you are in the right part of the country. It is expanding its range at the moment, so if you haven't seen it yet, there's a chance it might be heading your way. Its life cycle and its sort of behaviour and habits are really quite similar to the dark-edged bee fly. It also uses the Andrena solitary bees. It also likes to visit flowers. It does seem to be confined slightly more to really warm sites that have got lots of bare ground and heat up really quickly in the sunshine. So it's a bit more of a sort of bare ground, brownfield site type species. So we've seen the dark-edged and the dotted bee fly, which, as I say, are the two that you're likely to see in the spring. There's a couple of other bombilious bee flies that come out later in the year. So we'll move on to the next one, which is the western bee fly, Bombylius canescens. And as its name suggests, it's a species with a distribution far on the west side of England and again in parts of Wales. There are some records for Scotland, but I'm not sure they're terribly recent actually, and I've not been sent any from Scotland very recently. In fact, I think we've got the distribution map here. So as I say, this is very much a southwestern species on the whole. It starts flying pretty much as the spring bee flies are beginning to die away in June, is about when the western bee fly starts to emerge. So they do overlap where their range overlaps, and you do have to look at them a bit closely to tell them apart and make sure that you're actually getting a good view of the wings to know whether they've got the dark edge band or the dots, or whether they're clear wings for this western bee fly. And then a bit later in the year, there's the fourth and the rarest of the Bombylius bee flies. This is the heath bee fly, Bombylius minor. It's not actually that much smaller than the other bee flies, and it does look very similar to the western bee fly. And one of the things you really need to double check are the hairs around the head, which are mostly dark for the western bee fly and mostly white for the heath bee fly. And you get this lovely white sort of halo effect around the head of the heath bee fly. And this really is a very scarce species in Britain, and always has been, I think. At the moment, its main populations are in the Dorset heaths, and there's been one of the Back from the Brink projects looking at the heath bee fly and trying to do some habitat conservation work for it in recent years, which hopefully is going to help keep the populations healthy in that part of the world. Rather oddly, the only other place you can see it is right at the northern end of the Isle of Man, where there's some sandy habitats that it seems to really like on that island. So it's a really disjunct distribution between those two places, and those are the only places where you can see it. Very much associated with these heathy, sandy sites, where you can see it feeding on a range of different flowers. Okay, we're now going to move on away from the Bombylius bee flies and look at some of the other types of bee fly. There's only 9 or so bee flies in the UK that are still established, so there's not too many species to choose from. And we're now going to look at some of the ones that do not have the long proboscis. So why are they bee flies? Well, they are in the same family, and they do have some very similar wing venation features, and that sort of picks them out as being closely related to the long proboscis bee flies. And they are, again, parasitic creatures, but these ones are no longer parasitic on bees. So what we're looking at the moment is the downland villa bee fly, Villa cingulata, and there are a couple of other species of villa bee fly in Britain, one of which is believed to be extinct, that's associated with heathlands, and another one that's associated with sand dunes and does seem to be quite well distributed on sand dune habitats around the coast. And these ones, we don't know very much about their life history. We don't really know for certain what the host is for the downland villa. It's believed to be caterpillars of noctuid moths, but nobody's ever really been able to track down exactly what they do with their eggs and how their larvae might find a noctuid larva and how they complete their development. So lots to find out about this one. It's also quite a mysterious species in that it appeared to go extinct in the second half of the 20th century. There were no records for about 60 years. And then in year 2000, it popped up again, first of all near Bristol and also in a site in the Chilterns. A few years later, it had started to spread out its range a little bit and had popped up in a few more places, looking at the records up to 2014. And since 2014, it's continued its spread and is now being seen quite widely in that southern central part of England and just creeping into the edges of Wales. And it's gone from originally being pretty much strictly confined to chalk grassland or limestone grassland. It's now being found in neutral grasslands, and just in the last year or so, it started turning up on heathlands as well. And in fact, we had a record from the New Forest just last year. So it does seem to be both spreading its range and expanding its habitats a little bit at the moment. If it ends up on sand dunes, it's going to cause a problem because it's going to make it very hard to identify from the very similar sand dune villa. Okay, so that's an example of the villa bee flies. We've got a couple more types of bee fly to look at. The next one is the mottled bee fly, Thyroidanthrax fenestratus. The fenestratus part of its name refers to windows. That's from the Latin for windows, and it has these wings with dark markings on them with little transparent windows in the middle of the dark markings. And this is another heathland species confined to southern England, mostly Dorset, Hampshire and Surrey are the strongholds where you get sandy heathlands. And this one is a parasite of the sand wasp, Ammophila pubescens, which provisions its nests with the caterpillars, and then the wasp larva feeds on the caterpillar. The bee fly then comes along and attacks the wasp larva. So there's a sort of three-decker approach going on here of the caterpillar being preyed on by the wasp larva, which in turn is preyed on by the bee fly larva in the nest. So rather a lovely pattern species, this one, but you do have to go to the right places to stand a chance of seeing it. It seems to be reasonably easy to find on some of these southern heathlands, though, if you go and look for it there. That one was Thyroidanthrax. There's another bee fly that has the rather alarming name of Anthrax anthrax. And this does tend to cause concern when we start banding the names around. And underlying the word anthrax, the roots of that are the Greek word for coal. And it also has links with the word anthracite for a type of coal. And really, it just refers to something that has a dark colour. And the reason that we talk about a disease, anthrax, is because that is a disease that it produces dark blackish boils on the skin. And that's why the disease anthrax ended up with a similar name. But its origin is just to talk about this sort of black substance, and that is an example of the very hard anthracite coal. So based on all that, we decided to call anthrax anthrax the anthracite bee fly, when it turned up in Britain, which it did very recently. There's a couple of old records that seem to be rather dubious and perhaps didn't come from the UK at all. So the first really proven occurrence in the UK was in 2016, when Rob Mills found it in his garden in Cambridgeshire. This bee fly is another parasitoid of solitary bees, and this time the ones it likes to go for are the mason bees that nest in the bee hotels or in holes in walls. And in the Netherlands, the bee fly has been spreading quite rapidly and seems to be following the popularity of people putting bee hotels out. So it wasn't seen again in Cambridgeshire, or it wasn't indeed seen anywhere in 2017 and hasn't been seen in Cambridgeshire again since. But in 2018, Michael Woods found it near Canterbury, and it was seen there again the following year and the following 2 years. And just last year, it's been found at another site near Canterbury and a new site in Essex. So it does seem to be getting a foothold in this country, and there's every chance that it will continue to spread. The first glimpse that Michael Woods got in Canterbury was this rather blurry photo, which was a little bit difficult to sort of absolutely confirm which species it was, but we thought it probably was this bee fly. But Michael has gone on to see lots more of them and to get many fantastic photos of them, and they are now a regular feature of his patch, visiting flowers, and they particularly like to investigate this wall where the solitary bees are nesting in the mortar between the bricks. I don't think Michael has quite yet managed to pin down exactly which species of bee the bee fly is associated with, where he sees them, but they definitely seem to be very keen on this particular wall. And the final bee fly example is the smallest of our bee flies, and it's so good they named it 3 times, the flea bee fly, which is actually not terribly easy to say, and its scientific name is also not terribly easy to say, Phytheria pulicaria. So this really is a very tiny bee fly, only about 3 or 4 millimeters long. It's one that flies in the summer, and it's another real sand dune specialist, so you're not really likely to see it away from sand dunes. It particularly likes these yellow composite flowers growing over bare sand. It is quite widely distributed around the coast of the UK, but it doesn't often get recorded, and I suspect it's probably overlooked in many places due to its very small size. So if you are within reach of sand dune habitats, I'd really encourage you to go out and look for this one a bit later in the year and see if we can add to our knowledge of it and find out how widespread it really is around the coasts. So it is tiny, not terribly fluffy, but still a little bit. I'd say it's quite cute. And is it still deadly? Well, yes, it is. And this one, it's a parasitoid of micromoths, although again, we don't really know exactly which micromoths it goes for. So more detective work needed to try and find out a bit about this one. Okay, I'm going to briefly pause now and see if there's any questions to pick up on, and then in the next section, the last section of the talk, we're going to look at the Bee-Fly Watch project and what it's discovered, and then we'll pick up on a few more questions at the end. But if there are any questions that we can just deal with at the moment, that would be good as a quick break.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I can do that for you, Martin. Okay, let's go. I've got a list here. So we've got one asking, do bee flies lay one egg per bee nest or multiple eggs per bee nest?
They lay multiple eggs in the vicinity of bee nests. So as I say, they're not terribly precise about how they do that. So it's not a matter that they find one hole and fire an egg into it and then go off and find the next hole and fire an egg into it. They find areas that they think have holes in it, and then they sort of scatter their eggs in the general vicinity. So there's quite a lot of hit and miss to it, but it seems to work for them.
Off the back of that, is there like a specific period of time within the year that they will lay eggs, or do they do it throughout the year?
That's a very good question. In the next bit of the talk, we're going to go on to look at the flight periods of bee flies in a little bit more detail. But I don't think I know the answer to that. And I don't recall ever seeing that sort of written down anywhere. And whether bee flies are capable of sort of laying eggs over an extended period of time, or whether each individual lays its eggs and then dies and then another individual comes along, and whether they do that all the way through their flight period, I don't actually know. So there's another area there that is ripe for people to go out and try and observe and record the behaviour of the bee flies in a bit more detail and add to our knowledge about that.
Awesome. Hannah asks, she's curious to know if the bee fly uses sight to find burrows, or does it use some other sense?
Right, that's another question I haven't got a very good answer to. I don't really know that either. I'm pretty sure it must involve sight. They do, as we can see in Luke Chambers' amazing photo here, they do have quite large eyes, and they do seem to be visually aware. So I'm sure sight has got something to do with it, and the fact that they get confused between bee burrows and cracks in the ground and twigs on the ground and so on suggests that sight is part of it, but it's not necessarily totally precise. But we also saw that chart that shows that they're capable of laying more eggs when they think they found a bee burrow. Whether there is some pheromone type effect that they're picking up on there, it's entirely possible. They do have antennae and other sensory hairs on their body that would be able to pick up pheromone type scents. Maybe they're capable of actually observing the solitary bees going in and out of their burrows and picking up on that as well. So again, I can speculate that they may be picking up on those things, but I don't really know.
Joyce asks, are they evenly distributed across the UK, and will she see any as far as the northwest?
We'll find that out in the next section of the talk.
Beautiful, love that. The sentient iPad Air C asks, do different species of bee fly have different bee hosts or preferences?
They do have different preferences, although they do overlap to some extent. So the dotted bee fly seems to be quite strongly associated with Andrena cineraria, the ashy mining bee that we looked at earlier, and another Andrena species, Andrena flavipes. But the dark edge bee fly will also use both of those, plus a wider range of Andrena bees. And then the western bee fly seems to go more for the lasioglossum mining bees, and the heath bee fly is associated with the Colletes mining bees. So they all go for mining bees, but there are distinct preferences for them. And then, as we saw with the other bee fly species, they have different hosts again. So there's definitely some specialization there between the different species, but a little bit of overlap.
Cool. Joy asks, what sort of plants could you put in a garden to attract bee flies?
Primroses are a very good bet, but they're not too fussy. They will feed on quite a wide range of other flowers. Honesty is another one that I've seen them feeding on quite often. If you've got room for the flowering shrubs like sallows, they'll go for that. Hawthorn, they'll visit from time to time. So as I say, they're not too fussy. And I think both in terms of supporting the bees and the bee flies and the solitary bees in the spring, having a decent range of flowers is good. But with bee flies, they do have, as we saw, the option of using the longer tubular flowers as well as the more flat flowers that some of the other flies prefer.
I've got one from Sally, who asks, do you know if the males mate with multiple females? Or do we not know?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that. No, that may well be known, but I don't know it off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I'd have to go and look that up.
Awesome. We've got another one here asking, do you know what the length of each life stage of a bee fly is?
The adult bee flies, I think, probably live for 2 or 3 weeks, and they then lay their eggs, of course. The eggs hatch quite quickly into those initial larvae, and then I think the longest stage will be the larval stage. What I can't remember off the top of my head is how long they spend as a larva compared to a pupa and when they actually change into that final pupal stage. But I'm pretty sure the larval stage will be the longest part of it, and that's of course when they're feeding and shedding their skin and growing. And then at some point over the winter and into the following spring, they will turn into the pupa, which then emerges in the spring. So that's the typical life history.
Awesome. And Jennifer asks, are there any parasites that bee flies get? Hyperparasites.
Not that I know of, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to find out that there might be some parasitic wasps that go after the bee flies that go after the bees, because that's the way that the natural world seems to work when we come to insects and parasites. But again, I can't think of any examples of that I've actually come across.
I think that's everything I've got. As you mentioned, you're going through distribution, so got a few distribution questions, so that's cool. And just to confirm to Rory that bee flies are not dangerous to human beings unless you happen to be a giant sentient bee.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to the last bit of the talk then, which brings the focus back onto Bee Fly Watch. So Bee Fly Watch is a fairly sort of informal recording project that the recording scheme sort of kicked off in 2016, I think was the first year we started to do this. And it doesn't involve anything terribly sophisticated. It's really just encouraging people to get out and enjoy watching bee flies, and then of course to send the records in so that we start to build up a better set of data about bee flies and what they get up to. It focuses on the 2 spring species, although we're very pleased to have records of the summer ones as well later in the year. But the main focus of Bee Fly Watch is trying to see the bee flies as they emerge in the early spring. And I'm very pleased to say that it has proved to be quite popular. Before we started doing Bee Fly Watch, we might get 100 or 200 records a year. And since we started doing it, we're well up into the thousands. So we are getting a lot better information on what the bee flies are actually doing, which is fantastic. I say you don't need any sophisticated equipment to take part, and it's not a project that's run in any particularly sophisticated way either. It's basically just me and some of my colleagues in the recording scheme trying to be as enthusiastic as we can about bee flies and getting other people to look for them, send their records in, and we promote it through Twitter and Facebook, and that's basically it. If any of you do see bee flies, please do send your records in and we'll show you how to do that in a moment. All the details are up on the Soldierflies and Allies recording scheme website, and we have a special page for Bee Fly Watch, and you can actually add records to that page, but you can also go to iRecord or use the iRecord app, or if you don't use iRecord, you can send the records directly to us in a spreadsheet or something. And on that page, you can also download identification guides, and there are links to all sorts of other bits and pieces about bee flies. The identification guide covers the 4 Bombylius species. One of the things it includes is a page on some of the things that occasionally get confused with bee flies. And as we've seen, they are quite distinctive insects, but it is still possible to get confused with other things. Probably the most frequent confusion species is the one at the top left here, the hairy-footed flower bee, Anthophora plumipes, which is a solitary bee, but it's one that hovers in front of flowers really well and can look quite similar to a bee fly when it does that. It also has a habit of extending its tongue out. It's not as long as a bee fly's proboscis, but it does sort of get it sticking well forwards, which also makes it look a bit like a bee fly. But it has much longer antennae than a bee fly, and its wings are clear and do not have the dark edge or the dots of the 2 bee fly species. So if you're at all unsure about identification, it's well worth having a look at the ID guide and getting some tips from that. And if we look at all the records that have been added to iRecord since we started Bee Fly Watch, this gives you an idea of the overall distribution. So the dark-edged bee fly really is quite widely distributed across the UK and up into Scotland. It avoids the real upland areas, and there are a few other little patches where it doesn't seem to be seen quite so often. But basically, it is really quite widely distributed in the lowlands, at least. There are some records for the Republic of Ireland, but it does seem to be genuinely scarce over there. And the western bee fly also occurs in Ireland, but that is also not terribly common. On the right-hand side, we have the map for the dotted bee fly, which, as we said, is much more restricted to the southern part of England and Wales. Very amazingly, we did get a record popping up a couple of years ago at Hathersage near Sheffield. That wasn't repeated in 2021, but it does give an indication that there is perhaps still some expansion to come in the dotted bee fly range, which is very, very good news, because if we go back to the 1990s, people were really worried about the dotted bee fly. And there is the distribution map that was compiled in 1999. And as you can see, it's expanded its range enormously since then. And that's not just extra recording, it is a genuine expansion of the dotted bee flies range. It used to be found in East Anglia, so it hasn't got back there yet. But if it keeps going, it may well be able to recolonize that area as well. So the other thing that Bee Fly Watch gives us a lot of information on are the flight times and when the bee flies actually emerge. And we're looking at the charts here for 2018 in green and 2019 in brown. 2018 was quite a cool late year. 2019 was a bit earlier. And if I now add the next year, 2020 in blue, this was the first lockdown year when we were a lot of us were stuck at home, confined to gardens or parks, and we also had a really hot early spring into April, and consequently we had a real peak in bee fly observations and recording, and hopefully a lot of people enjoyed seeing the bee fly while they were stuck at home. 2021 was a little bit below that sort of peak, started off reasonably early again, but then had a bit of a dip and carried on sort of later into the year. So most years, bee flies start flying around the end of February, beginning of March, but in recent years, early sightings in February have become a little bit more common. March is the time of the distribution builds and the emergences build. April is the real peak, and then they die away through May, but a few of them seem to hang on into June and even into July. And I don't really know whether those are bee flies that have emerged very late and then fly late, or whether they're ones that have just hung on longer than just particular old aged individuals that managed to hang on, or whether there's even a possibility that some of them fit in 2 broods during the season. So this is another area of uncertainty that only more observations are really going to be able to tell us what the true answer to that is. And there does seem to be some fairly clear connections with temperatures. Bee flies are warmth-loving creatures, and I haven't done any formal analysis of this, but there does seem to be a really clear correlation at least. So if we look at 2018, we had a really cold February and March and a really late bee fly emergence. Whereas if we look at 2020 in blue, we had a really warm April, resulting in that very high peak for bee flies. And in 2021, March was quite warm, but April dipped away again. And even that seems to be reflected quite well in the bee fly records. So temperature is definitely a large part of what determines what goes on. I'm going to very quickly take you through the bee flight period and how it relates to where they emerge. So looking at the last few years, the earliest emergences that there has ever been was on the 17th of February. And as you'd expect for a warmth-loving species, they tend to emerge first in the south of England. And we're going through week by week, and you can see the dots starting to fill up on the southern part of the map as we go into March. By the middle of March, two things happen. The dark-edged bee fly starts to pop up in Scotland, usually on the east coast side, and then the dotted bee fly starts to put in its appearance around the middle of March back in southern England again. And then from the middle of March onwards, we start to see this main emergence of the bee flies, and lots of dots start to appear on the maps as we go through April. And then we carry on into May, still records coming in. The dotted bee fly usually stops around the beginning of June, but the dark-edged bee fly does seem to carry on for a few weeks longer, as we were just saying, with the latest ever confirmed record being on the 25th of July, a really late date. So that's the pattern, and it's really been fantastic to have the records coming in through Bee Fly Watch to actually allow us to start investigating in this sort of detail exactly what happens to the pattern of emergence and distribution over time. The other fantastic thing about Bee Fly Watch is just seeing people get so much enjoyment from going out and seeing these spring insects. And people have lots of different ways of expressing that. The pictures at the top here are some of John Walter's wonderful sketches of insects in the field. And he makes some wonderful observations of their behaviour and what they get up to. This particular example is for dotted bee flies. I think last year it was that Leanna Dixon put out on Twitter this wonderful embroidery that she'd done of the dark-edged bee fly, which I think captures it really, really well. A few years ago, a primary school in Kent decided to have a go at Bee Fly Watch, and they had a whole class project on bee flies, and they very kindly sent me some of the drawings that they'd made around that, which were absolutely amazing to see. I think they capture the bee fly quite well in those drawings. And bee flies do seem to inspire lots of positive reactions from people. And it's always one of the sort of real pleasures of being involved in Bee Fly Watches, seeing all the sort of celebration and enjoyment that people get from seeing the insects emerge in the spring. And at the moment, our chief bee fly whisperer is Charlotte Rankin, who last year went out on a very cold and windy day and found some bee flies that looked as if they were getting really windswept, and very kindly picked them up and moved them to somewhere a little bit more sheltered, which they seem to be very grateful for. And that particular Twitter post has inspired an awful lot of likes and enthusiasm, and continues to do so even a year after the event. So I think this is yet another bit of evidence that the fluffy and cute part of the equation does seem to draw a lot of people into watching and hopefully enjoying these insects and learning a little bit more about all the interactions that they have with both the plants and their solitary bee hosts. Which brings me to the end of the talk. I've got a nasty feeling I might have gone a bit over time, so apologies if I've gone on too long for anyone who was had to be away. But I would strongly encourage you to go out and enjoy watching bee flies. We have had one record this year on the astonishingly early date of the 8th of February down in Sussex. But as yet, or at least as of 2 hours ago when I last checked, nobody has reported a second one this year. In my part of the world, at least, we have sunshine forecast over the next few days, and I would not be at all surprised if a few more records start appearing in those sheltered, warm locations. But if you do see a bee fly, please add your record to iRecord or send it to us, or you can put it onto the iNaturalist platform and it will come through to us that way. Dipteristforum is the society to join if you want to learn more about flies in general, but anybody can take part in Bee Fly Watch, and do follow us on Twitter and Facebook to join in the fun and see what everybody else is finding out. So that brings me to the end, and just to say a very big thank you to everybody who does take part and send their records in, and to all the wonderful photographers whose pictures I've shown you today, and especially to Martin Drake for that wonderful study of the bee flies on the solitary bee bank in Devon. Okay, that brings me to the end of the talk.
Thank you, Martin. That was absolutely super. Really informative. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. I mean, I've got one question that I wanted to sort of highlight, because there's a few people that have asked it. Do bees have any natural defense against bee flies?
Not that I'm aware of, no, because obviously the bee larva that the bee flies are predating on is itself quite immobile and doesn't really have much in the way of defense. So I guess the main defense for the solitary bee is that the bee flies just aren't that good at finding the bee burrows. But if a bee larva gets into a bee burrow, then I don't think there's very much that the bee can do about it.
Awesome. Okay, we'll leave it there today because we're overrunning. Just a reminder, if you want to get hold of Martin outside of this, I've put some links in. There's also, so Martin's Twitter is @KiteNet, if I recall. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome.